Arc 2, Twig, Part 1. Something clattered and rattled as it was dropped onto a table before someone, male, average height, thin, exhaled, either in exhaustion or relief. Is that the last of them? Anything that's not connected to something vital, at least. A pause. I've never had to perform so much surgery on a child, much less a surgery like this. We're really pushing what a child's body can handle. I'm surprised you didn't... She heals fast. Good news, I guess. The Aburame are probably better at dealing with extreme body modifications than most. Otherwise... The men trailed off as if they didn't want to voice the words aloud. But on the table nearby, there was a mass of what for a moment I thought were bloody bones. But no, that was just an illusion caused by my limited swarm, with my personal hive somehow trapped inside my body and the room around us isolated. I'd snuck a few bugs inside while I was unconscious, but it was a paltry number, rendering my perceptions vague. But the pieces on the table weren't bone-shaped. They were more like shards of pottery, with smooth curved surfaces on one side and odd jagged ridges on the other. Something about them seemed familiar, though. Parts of her body dissolved into that chrysalis, and then began to reform. I don't know what would have happened if she'd gotten here a bit later. What happened in the Aburame district? Poisoned by chakra. Her mother and brother both. They say her bugs removed the worst of the chakra, for better or worse. Was no one else? The technique made it safe. But not for his granddaughter. What a sick joke. Are they? I opened my eyes. It hurt. A lot. I took stock of the situation. The men I'd hurt, thought I'd hurt, were gone. So were the objects I hadn't gotten a good look at. But I realized immediately that I was in a hospital, because my swarm had marked various surfaces while I was unconscious. Days had passed, I realized immediately. An old habit let me keep track of time by putting bugs on the hands of a mechanical clock. But that only tracked time within a day. But the growth of different species told me the day. My own bugs were not a good benchmark at the moment, but I could feel the swarms of several Aburame that were familiar to me, and recognized the distinctive markings of several Gikaichu. Based on their growth, I'd been out for at least 4 days. I might have even been hospitalized for a week. My grandfather was in the room with me, I realized before I even laid eyes on him, sensing the swarm inside of him, warped and changed as they now felt. Mine had changed too, seemingly enough so that they decided to wrap my body in some kind of strange cloth in place of normal bandages, and burn oddly scented candles all around the room in an effort to keep the bugs inside my body from crawling out during whatever medical procedure they performed. Although maybe that was just standard procedure with the Aburame. Something in the sense left my swarm docile, like bees that had been freshly smoked, in exchange for encouraging them to consume more of my chakra, in preparation for some perceived threat. It was an instinctive response, one I could override if needed, but for now I let it be, because my swarm was... strange. From the outside looking in, that change might have seemed cosmetic, at least at first. They'd adopted traits of the golden tortoise beetle, presumably because I was cursed, but I knew my swarm inside and out. What was seemingly barely changed on the outside were a chimera on the inside. Warped amalgamations of the bugs that had died to resurrect them, and I could feel the trigger within them. The transformation waiting to occur. Around my chakra network and my organs, still raging chakra became something like meat as the swarm ate, molded and became it, growing into jutting limbs and pulsating organs. Mutated insects gathered and intertwined into an organic mass that somehow both fed and fed upon my body, like a tree whose roots extended throughout my limbs, gripping my organs and somehow keeping them functional. This tree filled the hollow places in my body, of which there were a shocking amount now, and the other bugs made it their nest, feeding on the chakra and nutrients that flowed through it. It was familiar in a distant but terrifying way. Like chunks of my body had become a miniature garden of bodies and limbs for an array of creatures that couldn't quite decide what shape or even species they were supposed to be. I seemed to be mostly fine, other than that. If surprisingly so, when parts of me felt like they should be on the verge of collapse, they were so empty of support. But my grandfather was missing an arm, and from experience, I knew how much that sucked. He didn't seem to have full motion in one of his legs either. My father was in the hospital too, but not in a room. He was standing in one of the halls, pacing nervously, but with all limbs intact. Members of the Aburame clan were easy for me to pick out from a crowd. They were the ones full of bugs after all. But I didn't sense anything like that inside the room he was pacing in front of, and unless it was one of his friends, it steeply narrowed who it could have been. I couldn't sense my mother anywhere in the hospital. Oh no, I thought, heart beating quickly. And whatever had happened to me, it was bad enough that even that hurt. My pounding heart seemed to agitate the root-like growth intertwined with it, and that agitation echoed throughout my body. The room was locked and sealed from the inside, so it might have been an emergency room, which was terrifying to think about. Through the senses of my father's swarm, I could tell that there were seals on the walls, but not on the floor. If needed, I could get in that way, to check on her. But no, even in an emergency room, there should be a vent, be other ways in and out. It'd just take me a minute and I'd find them. Aside from that, there were several other members of my clan in the hospital, but their injuries didn't seem too serious. Probably meaning that everyone with serious wounds had died in the chaos. However, since the village was still here, and the people outside were talking and working on reconstruction already, it seems we'd really weathered the attack, and nothing major had followed it. With some kind of evil mastermind behind it all, I hadn't been sure what would happen when I blacked out, so that was good. Was Mother hurt? I asked, staring up at the ceiling. My words were met with a long pause. Through the bugs inside him, I felt my grandfather look my way, even as his hands filled with his unlit pipe again. His jaw moved for a moment, even as he bit his tongue, before finally sighing quietly. How about you worry about yourself first? Grandfather finally said. You're grounded forever, by the way. It was more of an effort than it should have been to turn my head enough to look at him. Through my swarm, I absently noticed a signet ring in my father's pocket that had previously been my grandfather's, once marking him as the clan patriarch, and now presumably doing the same for my father. From the talk around the clan, the shift had been a long time coming, to the point where the passing of the ring was just a formality, but it seems that after my grandfather's wounds, he'd officially passed the position on. He'd been injured protecting the thirds while fighting on the front lines, and had used his name as an excuse, so hopefully he'd retired with full honors, whatever that meant in a land of ninjas. I waited. I had more or less full awareness of my grandfather's physiology, and it was easy for me to tell he had more to say. You nearly died, you know, he continued after a while, the fingers on his remaining hand twitching around his pipe. Why'd you do that? It might have been meant to be accusatory, but his tone shifted around the words, becoming something simply inquisitive. It was hard to keep looking at him, and my body ached enough that I just returned to looking at the ceiling. This is the village my father and grandfather were fighting for, I said, and where my mother and little brother will live. Even without looking at him, I didn't miss his reaction to that, the tensing of his fingers around the pipe. Oh no, I thought again. Elsewhere in the hospital, my bugs found a vent. My grandfather shifted and then relaxed, or maybe made himself relax. That silk of yours saved my life, bedbug, he said gently, seemingly unaware of what he'd given away. Just like you saved a lot of people's lives, you did a good thing, but you did it in a bad way, Tora, because you nearly lost your own life doing it. I made a sound of acknowledgement more than agreement, but if it wasn't for the situation, I might have smiled at his words. Doing good things in a bad way might need its own chapter in my biography, right after doing the wrong things for the right reasons. A couple hundred people came by, he drawled, thanking me for saving their lives, their parents' and children's lives. I can see the good you did on each of their faces, Tora, but knowing what you had to do it, His muscles quivered. This was the point where he probably wanted to stand up and pace to emphasize his point. But the thing about getting hospitalized is that grievous injuries don't make allowances for dramatic gestures. You shouldn't have been in that fight, he murmured, grief in his voice. If the QB had landed one of those attacks, I'd have died even if I wasn't involved, I pointed out in disagreement. Whether I should have been involved doesn't matter. They didn't ask for our opinion. He put down his pipe and covered his face with a hand, trembling slightly. Maybe he was remembering the events of that day, or maybe something else. I snuck a bug into the emergency room and did my best to eavesdrop, but I was apparently past the point where the doctors conveniently monologued every detail of what was happening. Damn it. Hopefully there'd be a rerun soon. I could feel her pulse, at least. It was weaker than I'd have liked, but it didn't seem dangerously weaker. Although I couldn't exactly give a full medical examination with a single bug. But when that bug crossed her belly, it was clear that the child was gone, and that the marks of surgery were clear enough. But was he gone? Or just... Instead of thinking about that, I stole several Kakaichu from my clan members and scattered them throughout the hospital. It was possible to identify someone's clan based on their chakra, as certain traces and signifiers were inherited. I searched for Naburame that didn't have a hive inside them yet. True enough, my grandfather finally murmured. How do you feel? Hurts everywhere, I admitted. You're lucky, believe it or not, he said. You're young, so your chakra network is still malleable. If it wasn't, you might have just popped instead of trying to contain so much chakra. I didn't bother mentioning it wasn't just that I'd had to sacrifice countless bugs to filter, absorb and reintroduce that chakra, also I wouldn't explode anyway. Or how I'd had to desperately adjust and readjust that chakra again and again to suit myself to it and to others. Because all that would have done was emphasize how dangerous what I'd done was. The process of continuously having my swarm eat off the excess chakra before I hit the breaking point, and reviving the vital bugs who died, had killed enough bugs that it was probably going to have knock-on effects on the entire ecosystem, unless I was really careful about reintroducing species for the next few years. But in my defense, the QB turning the entire village into a smoldering crater would have done similar damage, so I wasn't too broken up about it. But that it had been a bizarre and violent enough process that it had apparently mutated my internal swarm into... I'm not even sure what. My power and the scent around us was keeping them pacified, but the agitation and hunger in them went beyond the physical and instinctual. They were still alive, at least in a technical sense, but there was an urge, a desire within them now that was almost physical, to find and devour more chakra, not to satisfy the biological needs of the Kakaichu, but something far vaster and deeper. Or maybe it was my overflowing chakra that was doing that, and the bugs were just eating it before it drove me into a frenzy. Because if my chakra was normally gold, then there was something in me now that was a deep, dark red, and it felt like hate and hunger burned in my veins. Or it could be both, I thought. I'd killed and revived my swarm over and over again on an altar stained with billions of sacrifices, in order to help them contain a chakra so massive and furious that it melted skin on contact. it shouldn't be a surprise if there were some side effects. I thought of my dream, or what my power had shown me while I was wavering in and out of consciousness. A table riddled with bloody knot bones that had been removed during surgery. For a moment, I imagined myself growing an exoskeleton, the organic growth around my chakra network and vital organs forming an organ system, while everything else just dissolved, making room for more of the swarm. For me as well. Slowly, I focused on myself through their senses, feeling a rage that resonated enough to shake me, like how I'd felt the emotions and memories of my army during my fight with Sion. At the same time, I felt its redness filling my chakra network like a massive living scar, and my swarm clustered around it, consuming as much as they could, melting around it like a biological mesh and reforming from it later. That chakra was exchanged between members of the swarm, digested, filtered, and then the excess was fed back into me, keeping me relatively stable. Of course, if I didn't have such absolute control over my swarm, they'd have probably gone berserk and torn me apart from the inside. But I decided not to think about that right now. For a moment, we were stuck in an equilibrium. That redness, though, it was obviously the Kyuubi's chakra. Even separated from the whole and days later, it was like it was alive and still hated everything, and perhaps especially me. My grandfather remained silent as I gave my swarm another evaluation. Part of the etiquette of a clan of bug users, maybe, and then continued like I told him about what I'd found. I guess he'd already figured out something similar after checking himself. You'll have to be careful. This change in our Kakaichu is dangerous, especially for you, he murmured, looking at his hands. The Kakaichu technique is meant to be performed slowly. The reason it's introduced shortly after birth is because both a newborn's body mass and chakra are small. When both room and food are limited, it's natural for a population to grow slowly and remain low, and with some careful guidance, it can be done safely. But if food is abundant, while space is limited, a hive can quickly grow out of control. I know your control is extensive, but if you lose your grip on them... He shook his head. And your chakra is so out of sync with your body, it's like all the food in a country is being funneled to its capital. Uncontrolled and unsustainable growth wouldn't be surprising. It's a miracle that your swarm didn't already burrow somewhere dangerous. I wondered how much the doctors had told him, or even understood of what they'd seen. I felt more like a hive than a person at the moment, with whole sections hollowed out, and even then it was a tight fit in places. Odd to feel both empty and bloated. If I stood in front of a spotlight without my swarm inside me, you might be able to see the light shine through me in places. But despite that, his worries wouldn't come to pass. My power was active even while I was asleep. Then again, when I wasn't conscious, it tended to be controlled by my passenger, and I wasn't entirely sure where they stood on a sliding scale of non-essential organs versus more bugs. Given my current condition, maybe I should worry about that. I didn't feel like I was missing anything important at the moment, but I knew that the passengers could get a bit iffy on what they considered necessary for their hosts. But I didn't need more space inside me to control more bugs, is the thing. You'll have to lay off exerting yourself for a while and eat as much as you can, my grandfather continued. Your body needs all the nutrients it can get right now, between being hospitalized and dealing with a growing altered swarm. It's recommended that Aburame children eat 4 meals a day when they start getting growing pains. But for you, I'd lean towards 5 or 6. And even then, I suspect it'll be an effort for you to put on the weight you need. If you can stand it, I'll have the nurses get you something to eat every hour, and we'll go from there. I wasn't sure that was necessary. Once I wasn't in a hospital and built up the local species again, I'd feed my swarm with the stuff outside my body. And even while it was an issue, I could make my swarm lie dormant as long as I was conscious for it. But I figured he was just worried and falling back on what he knew in response, so I nodded in agreement anyway, putting forth the effort to actually do so to show that I understood and took this seriously. And that seemed like enough self-care. "Is mother alright?" I tried again. "And is my brother okay?" Again, silence filled the room. My grandfather seemed to mull over that question for a while, fiddling with his pipe again, as if trying to measure and weigh what to say. "She's okay for now, but the child is a concern," he murmured at last. "Complications from the attack. I suppose a bijou attack isn't the best time for a pregnancy." "Or seeing your daughter start to melt was bad for it," he was kind enough not to say. Again, injuries care not for dramatic gestures. I tried to sit up, despite how much my body hurt, and very quickly realized it wasn't happening. Instead, I focused, gathering my chakra, and it hurt badly enough that I almost screamed. Me! But that didn't mean I couldn't use it. "Take me to him," I said. "I can fix this." "Hell no," my grandfather replied immediately, voice firm as steel, like he'd expected me to say this. "I won't lie and claim I have any idea what you did or how you learned to do it, but I'm still the head of the Aburame clan. You think I didn't notice how many bugs seemingly just dropped dead for no apparent reason? There were billions of them. They had to clean them up with shovels." He sat back in his chair, seemingly relaxed, but I could feel the tension in his muscles, as if he was expecting something to happen. "There's plenty of doctors looking after him. I think it's best that we leave it to them and keep you separate for the time being. Your father and I will take turns watching over each of you." Knowing what to look for, I'd found familiar yet unfamiliar chakra in another wing of the hospital. It was faint enough that I'd ignored it before, even flickering, but it felt like my clan's had traces of my father's and mother's chakra, though no longer my own after its recent dramatic change. Unlike my mother's room, which was quiet, hopefully because she was just being monitored, the doctors in this room were bustling, even loud, every one of them in constant communication, tracking changes and progress. It wasn't good. I wasn't an expert on medical terminology, especially not in this language. I couldn't even understand what most of the words meant hearing them rattled off so quickly like this. But there was a tone, a cadence, even a quickness to the words that made it abundantly clear that they were talking about something that wasn't good. And I could put the rest together from context clues. It had been 4 days and they were still working hard to keep my brother alive, dedicating 4 medical nin to the task. But the medical nin looked tired, and in the wake of the attack they must have been in short supply. That so many were dedicated to the task meant strings had been pulled. That they were still working meant the circumstances were severe. That they were tiring was a deathly bad sign. And my father was pacing outside my mother's room instead of my brother's. He'd already gotten the news and was trying to come to terms with it, as well as find the words to help his wife come to terms with it. Understanding that, I felt a protest rise in my throat and quashed it. Instead, I remained calm. I was in crisis mode now, so when one plan failed, I simply moved on to the next. The doctors didn't know enough to even consider it, but I don't recommend using chakra for a few weeks at least. Maybe even a couple months. Grandfather continued. Even if there's no permanent damage, you pushed yourself incredibly hard, and your body will need time to recover and adapt to the changes. There was even talk of potentially having to remove your Gekaichu, though I told them it'd do more harm than good. Even for normal Aburame, they don't react well to attempts to destroy their nests. And for us. He hadn't noticed me using chakra, I noted and filed away. If he was anything like me, his chakra control was in shambles, and so was his sense for it. Ignoring his probably good advice, I was already trying to make medical chakra, but my first attempt was abysmal. Despite what many people thought, members of the Aburame clan actually had a fair bit more chakra than the norm, as a consequence of constantly exercising it to feed and control their swarms. But right now, I was left trying to control a lot more of any fair bit. Not just that, the amount my bugs passively consumed was far greater than it had previously been. And since the chakra they were eating was poison to me, I couldn't just make them stop. I'd have to relearn how to control it, though hopefully it shouldn't take long, with my experience training it so recently. Except time was of the essence. From the sound of things, it was a miracle my brother had survived this long. He might not last another day or two. I went through my swarm instead. Outside my body, the bugs were still the same, aside from their utterly devastated numbers. The amount of chakra they each could draw was minuscule, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing when it came to medical ninjutsu. If I had them gather outside chakra for a few days, it'd be hard to do that subtly in a hospital. Surely at least some people were monitoring the area. Fuck it, let them wander. I gathered some of my bees and began to construct a beehive outside my mother's window, and formed another nest near the vents that led to my brother's room. I'm the one who caused this, I said aloud, because sometimes it's worth convincing people you are still focused on one plan, even when you'd written it off and moved on to another. Whether I'd actually done that remained to be seen, but still. You're gonna say that now? What happened to it being a grim necessity that you were dragged into by circumstance? My grandfather immediately replied, shooting me down before I could even suggest anything, which was probably unsurprising. You think my son and his wife wouldn't kill me if they knew I'd let their daughter sacrifice her life? You think I wouldn't want to kill myself? I fell silent at that, and tried my best to gauge it, because I wasn't sure how long to keep quiet to make a silence seem accepting, possibly a consequence of my near inability to accept things silently. To people who knew me, my silences tended to be more ominous than anything, because part of growing up is realizing that sometimes it's better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission, and part of growing up and becoming a supervillain was realizing that if you knew you couldn't get forgiveness or permission, but had resolved to do something anyway, you really just shouldn't ask, or you'd give yourself away. 5 seconds is probably enough, I judged. Can you get me some books about medical chakra then? I asked. And everything you can find about pediatrics, chakra related or otherwise. I didn't expect to learn anything practical in a matter of days, not from easily accessible books that people would allow me, but it could serve as a cover for whatever I was going to do about this mess, though what that was a work in progress. My grandfather squinted at me warily, maybe starting to get suspicious, but if so, hopefully about the wrong thing. I decided to push, hoping he'd continue to look in the wrong direction. If the hospital has it under control, then there's no loss. It just means I'll have wasted my time, I urged. But if there's something I can do, if he... I began before stopping myself, and I didn't have to fake that hesitation. Wouldn't you have wanted to know you did everything you possibly could if it was your brother? I whispered. He put the pipe in his mouth, even though it was unlit, and chewed on the end of it for a while, before slowly exhaling. At last he nodded, and stepped out for a minute to call a nurse, saying he wanted to understand something. Another request to one of the younger members of the Aburame clan got several books from the local library. When I was faced with the obvious issue of how I was going to read a book when I couldn't even sit up, he opened them and even offered to read them to me. It wasn't enough. I knew it, and so did he. The books were advanced, but they were levels of advanced. These were college textbooks to graduate level advanced, which were already pushing the limits of my understanding of medicine, but wouldn't reveal to me the secrets of medical chakra. I listened attentively all the same, and asked the questions I wanted answered, which were what the words the doctor had said meant, asking him to look them up in the index so I'd know where to even start. Respiratory distress syndrome, possible bronchopulmonary dysplasia, patent ductus arteriosus and low blood pressure, risk of intraventricular hemorrhage, risk of hypothermia due to low body fat, risk of necrotizing enterocolitis, risk of anemia, low blood sugar, risk of infection. plus about half a dozen potentially long-term issues on the off chance he survives, including a fairly high chance of sudden infant death syndrome. I did my best not to show my reaction as I connected meanings to the words I'd heard the medical nin use and understood the picture they painted. About 5 plans I'd been loosely considering died fell apart before they could even take shape, and 2 of the remainder became all but impossible as it turned what I'd suspected into a certainty, that if nothing was done, my brother wouldn't survive the next 2 days, and it'd take a miracle worker to do anything. For a moment, all I wanted to do was close my eyes. But I didn't. It was a basic trick I'd learned a long time ago, but one I'd also long since learned to be effective. Anyone with even a surface-level grasp of my powers should know that I didn't need to look at something to focus on it. But people somehow always seemed to care about where I put my eyes. So I watched my grandfather, even as he trailed off and it seemed to become harder and harder for him to read the words. He tried to distract me. He asked about what I'd done. He asked about the silk and masks I'd made. He even asked about the masked man I'd seen. I kept my answers brief and seemingly distracted by the book in his hands, while my attention was actually focused elsewhere. I didn't have time to relearn how to control my chakra perfectly, but since medical ninjutsu cared about chakra control more than anything else, I also couldn't afford not to. Not exactly an ideal situation, but it's crazy how the impending death of a family member will motivate you. Caught between a rock and a hard place, I worked around the problem instead, using an old trick through a more experienced lens. I gathered my chakra first and then had my bugs eat it down to precisely the right amount. Except even after they did that, the Kyuubi's chakra mixing with my own seemed to disrupt my hold over it, like it was fighting me. I wasn't in a position where I could afford to be irritated about that. Instead, I took advantage of the process I'd already observed and used my swarm as a backup chakra network, draining my own mixed chakra and cycling it between themselves before injecting it back in. The result was a more viscous, blended kind of chakra, but I could control it well enough to practice with it and get used to it again. The rest, I'd figure out when I wasn't in an emergency. At the same time, I listened to my grandfather read books on medical chakra aloud to me, focusing on the sections about pediatrics. Even if I had the control, I was worried that I might not have the understanding of biology, but thankfully I had lucked out in several ways. The biggest one was that it turned out I actually knew a fair bit about human anatomy, just not in a formal training kind of way, but because my bugs had eaten more than one person alive, so mostly I just needed to put names and explanations to the things I already knew existed. The other advantage was that I had bugs inside the Aburame clan to inform my understanding as well, although they tended to be confined to specific areas. At the same time, I spied on the Konoha hospital through the eyes of my swarm and the Kakaichi of my clan members. In the wake of such a disaster, the hospital was swamped with people in need of healing, and that gave me many chances to watch medical nin at work. I could feel and taste their chakra, could get bugs close enough to sense it flowing through their patients' bodies as they healed them. Academically, I knew that after completing the box training, the next step was to actually create medical chakra. The way to practice that was simple. An injured or even freshly dead animal would be laid out on a scroll that had a jutsu formula for the medical ninjutsu inscribed on it, which was meant to serve as a kind of training wheels for the process. So long as you molded the medical chakra correctly and input the right amount, the jutsu would occur without you having to focus on the specifics of it as well. From there, you'd slowly take over more and more of the process. But even if I knew that was the next step, I didn't have such a thing on hand, nor any way to get and use it subtly. But with how overwhelmed the hospitals were, they needed all the help they could get, and to that end, they drafted not only retired medics, but people who hadn't quite passed the exams, giving them a crash course in treating at least minor wounds. I couldn't make out the formula through a bug's eyes, but I could see how the chakra flowed through countless angles, and in no time at all, I verified another suspicion. There's not enough time, I thought. It was a silent, dismal acceptance. I tried anyway. I tried with my bugs, because it gave me a better sense for both sides of the process as I attempted to produce medical chakra, mirroring the examples all around me. I tried it again and again and again. But even if I was improving quickly, even if I was making strides, I couldn't mirror an example I didn't have. The real problem, the reason my brother was on the verge of death and none of the doctors here could save him, was because parts of his body simply had not developed enough for him to survive on his own. He required an incubator just to survive at all, but the stress and strain of his premature birth was wreaking havoc on his tiny body. For most medics, mending something like a cut that didn't hit anything vital was easy, just a matter of encouraging the body's natural processes. A broken bone was harder, as it touched upon and required considering more processes, but it was still possible with enough training. But something like regrowing an organ was next to impossible, and only next to because it was the domain of the highest level of medical ninjutsu. Curing a disease outright or fixing a congenital illness was slightly easier, but still the domain of the best, because to do that, boosting the body's natural healing wasn't enough, or could even backfire, because the body's natural processes were what was killing it. To fix that, you'd need someone who could control chakra so precisely that it could affect things on a cellular level and guide the patient's cells towards healing in an unnatural, precisely defined way. And that required not only incredibly in-depth medical knowledge, but tremendous chakra control and incredibly precise feedback from that chakra, such that you could respond to changes on that same level. There weren't a lot of people that could do that. In fact, as far as I knew, with the third's wife dead, there was exactly one left in the entire world, and Tsunade of the Sunny hadn't been in the village in years. The odds of her showing up in the village randomly, even if she heard that disaster had struck, were vanishingly small. The odds that my family and I could do anything to find her, in the whole 2 days I might have as a hospitalized baby, were even lower. And without her, it didn't matter who I used as an example or spied on, because they couldn't do what I needed to do either. I was confident in myself. I knew I had enough advantages and experiences that I was growing incredibly fast, not just for my apparent age, but in general. And if that hadn't been enough, do you know how motivating it was to know that if you failed, you might be the cause of your own brother's death? If I only had a little bit more time, I'd make it be enough. If I had just a year, I'd make it work, no matter what it took. But I didn't. And I wasn't so good or learning so fast that I could do in a day what had taken the greatest medic in the village's history decades to learn. If I had an example to watch, if I had time to practice and experiment, if I just had a chance. But I didn't. I couldn't find a way to save him in a matter of days, and neither could anyone else in the village. And so he'd die. Unless I cheated, of course. I remained calm, because I didn't have time to worry or panic either. I was backed into a corner, but I wasn't out of options. And even if what I had in mind failed, I still had the Makai Tensei, which might still work. If anything, that was probably the better bet. Except my own family wouldn't allow it. Even then, though, I hadn't taken over a city by doing things I was allowed to do. I didn't want to, but if I had to, I could disable my father and grandfather with my power, and crawl like my life depended on it. Or my brother's life, I suppose. All I had to do was get close. I might be a failure of a hero, but I wasn't so much of a failure that I wouldn't die for a child, for family. It's just that, on some level, they were expecting that. And even if I could disable my grandfather with his own swarm and cause a commotion with a big enough swarm of bugs, I wasn't confident about fighting any ninja that didn't already have bugs inside them as a baby. Even if I could circumvent the stairs by crawling on the walls, or convince my family to take me up to the 3rd floor, I didn't have the speed to escape pursuit by much of anyone, and it wouldn't be all that hard for them to disable a toddler. I didn't have enough time to risk wasting any on a sudden bout of unconsciousness, So even if it was more likely to work, I made it my last resort. I didn't want to start a fight in a hospital for just about every possible reason, but especially not a fight I couldn't win. Which left me one choice. "Grandfather," I asked suddenly, interrupting him as he read off a passage about retinopathy of prematurity. "Let me host the Rinkaichu." Again there was that pause as he looked at me, momentarily bewildered. Then, "Why the hell would I let you do that?" he demanded, startled. "How do you even know about that?" "Because you know what it's like to watch your brother die," I said. "And because I don't want to know, and because I can do it and save him, and then no one has to die." I didn't answer how I knew, because it was a silly question. No one could keep secrets from me in the Aburame household for long. Or at least no one with bugs under their skin. "Do you even know what hosting the Rinkaichu entails?" Grandfather continued, like he was offended I'd even asked. "If you're not naturally compatible with them, it'd take a miracle not to just die once you contract them. And even if you have the right antibodies, it's a sick thing to inflict on a child. The Rinkaichu may be insects instead of a disease, but the human body can't tell the difference between something that small, so it'll try to destroy them the only way it knows how, even if it means hurting itself. I'm talking fevers that never seem to break as your body tries to burn them out of its system, but it won't work. Then you'll lose weight as the very food you put into your mouth melts, taken by the swarm, because unless they're properly controlled, they aren't smart enough to tell how much food their host needs. So every meal is a battle over nutrients, and it's a losing battle. Shikuru was eating 10 meals a day, was on 5 prescription drugs, and took specialized vitamins, and he was losing weight until he finally got control. And then you'll actually get sick too. Your immune system will just randomly not working, because it's already overworked, or even targeted for attack. Years of just getting worse no matter what anyone seemed to do. When Hariken infected his son with a Rinkaichu, I threw him out on his fucking ass. And you want me to do that to my own granddaughter? And here's the sick part. All of that only matters if you're lucky. Because most people don't get sick from the Rinkaichu. They melt. I listened to all of that quietly, taking it in. Isn't that a small price to pay to save the life of someone you care about? I asked. My grandfather frowned at me. Then, after a while, he crossed his legs, foot popping up and down, put a book he'd been reading from down and opened up a newspaper. He seemed content to pretend like this conversation never happened. Intraventricular hemorrhage, I said. Basically, it means he'll start bleeding in his brain. The cell structures in a growing brain are delicate enough that if something goes wrong, it can spiral out of control, and his body can't auto-regulate his cerebral blood flow. Right now, the medicmen are trying to do it manually, hoping he'll grow out of the risky stages. But if one person gets tired, or his blood pressure goes up for any reason, the blood vessels are liable to rupture and hemorrhage into the germinal matrix. Patent ductus arteriosus means that part of his heart that allowed blood to bypass his non-functioning lungs in the womb is still open, and now it's working against him, and can't pump blood as well as it should, and they've been forced to treat his low blood pressure, knowing that if they overshoot it just a bit, they'll break the veins in his brain, and his lungs are lacking the surfactant they need to expand properly, so he's having trouble breathing. He doesn't have enough body fat, compounded by the fact that his body can't process what it does have very well, and they're stuck in a balancing act of trying to give his body everything it needs, while not giving it so much his brain pops. Enough! Grandfather said, and in that moment he was almost wide-eyed. He'll die, I said. It's unlikely he lasts a day without a constant rotation of medicnin sustaining him, and there aren't enough to go around. Unlikely he lasts a week even if they can spare enough for him. And even if he does survive, which he almost certainly won't, the odds are high he'll just drop dead sometime within the year, and it's just a question of which complication kills him. It's not even worth thinking about, he hissed, shutting his eyes tight. They'll eat you alive, literally and painfully, Even if you had the antibodies, which I know you don't, it wouldn't be worth considering. We're talking about a technique so risky that the clan has almost never had more than one or maybe two people alive at one time that could use it, and which masters of the clan's techniques don't even consider during the prime of their lives. You're a hospitalized baby whose existing form has already been mutated in dangerous, unpredictable ways, and you just came close to killing yourself with that jutsu of yours. What you and I hold now can't even be called Kikaichu anymore. They're Makaichu now, something just waiting to run out of control, and we can't predict how they might react to fucking anything. And then there's exposing the Rinkaichu to the Kyuubi's chakra. The best case is that they die on contact. The worst case is that they don't. I don't recommend introducing even normally benign insects to your hive until you've had at least a few years to carefully observe the current changes. And you think I'm willing to immediately introduce the most hostile species we have while you're still in the hospital? No. 1,000 times no. I was quiet for a moment at that, trying not to show that his words had affected me, but I won't let them be demon bugs, I murmured, and he opened his eyes to look at me. I won't let these bugs I created be something like that. I'll make them Shinshu instead, something that protected our family, starting with my brother. I can save him. I know I can. So isn't it worth trying? He grit his teeth before looking away for a long while, his remaining hand clenching the fabric of his pants before slowly relaxing. You're willing to fight to protect your family, he said. As the former head of the Abarame clan, I can acknowledge and respect that. But being part of a clan isn't just about protecting it. It's also about being protected by it, and protecting yourself. I won't do it, Taura. I refuse to put my granddaughter and grandson's lives on a scale. Grandfather, this conversation is over, he said with the voice of a clan head, before standing up with a fair bit of difficulty and meeting my eyes, firm as a mountain, bidding me to fall silent, which I did. After a while, he stepped out of the room, calling my father to come watch me. And then, for a long while, he just stood in the hall, hand on the wall, before leaving the hospital entirely. I'm sorry, grandfather. I thought, and I meant it. My words had been cruel enough that I felt bad for saying them, but necessary enough that I'd said them anyway. Because the thing is, sometimes it's enough to just plant the seed, to make someone consider it, and an idea, once planted, can be dreadfully hard to kill. It's like talking about someone stealing jewels or cars in the neighborhood. The mention of it might make someone check on their own, or even just look towards it. And asking, even begging, tended to give the impression that you needed permission. Which was silly. We're a family of ninja, aren't we? I'd already checked the compound, searching for them, but due to the damage, things had been moved around. The Abarame clan had been given new grounds and everything, part of a mass moving of the clans that had apparently been a lingering idea for about a decade, but too much of a pain in the ass to bother doing until half the clan's houses had gotten stepped on anyway. Most of Konoha's main clans had been with the village since its founding, but the years had left some of their original homes rather cramped, and so while the Nara and Hyuga had kept their ancestral homes, everyone else was moving around. And, unfortunately, since I couldn't feel the Rinkaichu directly, I couldn't be sure where they were, especially with everything being moved around while I was unconscious, which would make finding them a process that I didn't have time for. With maybe not even a day to spare, I couldn't afford to search for them blindly in a subtle way, nor did I have the leeway to risk anyone noticing what I was up to if I tried to do it directly. So, I didn't bother. Instead, when my grandfather went home, giving my father the excuse that he wanted to check on the rest of the clan, I activated my Higanbana, despite feeling like my body was on fire. Once he reached the new clan grounds and exchanged some greetings, as I'd suspected, the first thing he did was go underground to verify that everything had been moved over properly. With the damage done to the original compound, the clan had to move everything over in a hurry, using jutsu to carve an appropriately sized space underneath their new home as specialized containers to transport the clan's precious bugs. But they were still in the process of securing all their bug species in their new habitats. Most of them I could feel, but the place my grandfather stopped before was just an empty space to me. For a while, he was still. Then, after a while, he began to pace. I could imagine his thought process, the logic, or at least reality, that he could see in what I said, but was thinking of trying to do it himself, warring with the fact that he didn't have the ability, even if he could immediately control the Rinkaichu, which sounded exceedingly unlikely. He had even less training with medical ninjutsu than I did, and all the disadvantages of his swarm being changed. And yet, he paced. He considered it, weighing the pros and cons of what he knew to be a fool's errand, an impossibility. He turned to leave, and then looked back, eyes lingering for a long, long time, before shaking his head and leaving for good. Once he did, I had my termites go to work. My grandfather, recently grievously injured, have moved slow enough that I'd been able to make a few detours to gather up the dregs of my remaining bugs. The good news is, word of most of my experiments had apparently been passed on by my grandfather, and the clan had made an effort to transport them nearby themselves. The even better news was that the ones I hadn't mentioned were still where I'd left them. I had them take a circuitous path, staying several blocks away from my grandfather and out of sight, and snuck them in from a different entrance. Since I could innately tell the location of anyone with the Kekaichu technique, I navigated them around my clan carefully, having the bugs that were already inside the compound prepare the way by unlocking latched windows from the inside. Being a clan of ninja, you might think that the defenses and security measures around the Aburame clan's bugs were based on advanced jutsu and seals, but they weren't, because there were some inherent issues with locking chakra-eating bugs behind chakra-based defenses. Instead, most of them were physical or mechanical in nature, with the remainder being other bugs. Things like a box suspended by cables within another box, with a carefully mixed solution below it. The temperature carefully regulated in layers, sealed within a wooden case that another species could inhabit. Other bugs were at different layers of the defenses. Territorial shriekers said to give off frighteningly loud cries if they noticed anything awry. Kekaichu ready to react to anything chakra in nature. Other species waiting to react to chemical traces, etc. Most of the containers were Matrushka dolls, carrying 5 species in a careful balancing act, rather than a single species that might escape. And, of course, all around were members of the Aburame clan, a variety of bugs ready to react to any foreign scent or chakra. Needless to say, none of them reacted. Since I was the invader, not a single bug in the compound gave the slightest sign of warning. Instead, the bugs helped undo most of the defenses from the inside. All they needed was a way out. Shinshu Shiroari, I thought. Termite. A basic jutsu I developed by watching and experiencing termites eating through wood billions of times. I'm not even sure it deserved to be called a jutsu, but their tiny mandibles gnawed through the outer shell like it was made of marshmallow instead of wood, boring a neat, tiny hole through it. One bug entered, was past the payload, and simply left. Already I felt its pain receptors lighting up, but it didn't need to go far. A flying insect picked it up and flew off at full speed, my higanbana already starting to retract. In what felt like no time at all, the flying bug's body started to fail, but it was caught in the jaws of another, and another, and then another. Bugs passed it off again and again, mouth to mouth, or by contact, or by being eaten, but each carried it further and further towards me. As my range returned to its normal position, the way I'd already paved remained, a passage remaining through open windows and vents, a nest therein waiting to sacrifice itself for the cause. I had them pass their payload between them, waiting for the moment where my father wasn't watching me. and at the same time, my range began to quiver and shake. My grandfather was right about, really, probably everything he'd said, but the part I cared about was the practical concern. Aside from my Makai Tensei, the Rinkaiju were the only hope I had of saving my family, a species of bugs that could operate on the scale I needed. But if I couldn't control them, and control them precisely, I still wouldn't be able to do anything, and they were too small for me to control. This will work, I told myself. And if it doesn't, all it'll cost me is my life. My Higanbana had drawn inspiration from the Nara clan, and like their shadow techniques, its maximum extension was limited by the size of my range. No matter how I shaped and molded it, it couldn't cover a larger area than it started with. The question I had was, could it get smaller? And would it matter if it did? It will, I told myself. And so I focused, even as it felt like my head and body were throbbing. I felt my face flush from the effort, and so I did my best to turn away from my father, trying not to let him see it. The outside edges of my range continued to tremble, shifting this way and that. But I found that it wasn't as easy as applying an inward pressure. I maintained the shape of my range using countless hexagonal plates, and I couldn't make my range smaller while leaving them the same size. Its shape gave it structure, but also made it hard to compress. Unless I took a different approach. After a moment, I switched from applying pressure across all of my range in every hexagonal plate to pushing in singular pieces, shrinking them slightly and moving them partially out of the way, before either removing them entirely or using them to reinforce other locations. It was like an enormously complex puzzle, with millions of shifting parts moving in 3 dimensions, needing to be solved again and again. And I did. Invisibly, the edge of my power passed over and through buildings, cutting them off from my awareness. It passed over people, objects, and even insects, and they vanished from my sight. And as I cut my range in half, I felt the level of my control over bugs change and deepen. I was relieved, both that it had worked and that it was working in this way. This time I was using Ingenuous power as inspiration, trading range for power. But a part of me had worried it would manifest in a different way. Although if it had, well, that would have made plan B easier. So I guess I'd have lucked out either way. At half my normal range, I could feel my control deepen, but the effect was vague. I didn't have a great example, but the best way I could think of it was like this. If a seemingly seamless video was actually made up of many frames per second that the human eye and brain just perceived as being in motion, then let's say that the live updates I received from my bugs were actually similar snapshots that I received many times each second. Right now, I was upping that frame rate, maybe even the resolution. I might have been able to get clearer images of an area with fewer bugs, understood the tone and emotions in voices more easily through my bugs. If there were any other benefits, they were hard to see with the loss of range. I'd never really run into a limit on the number of bugs I could control, or how much I could multitask through them either, and nothing else really jumped out to me. Not useless, but not worth half my range. So, I kept shrinking it. And at first it was easy. Aside from the complexity of so many moving parts, I mean, halving my range again wasn't particularly difficult. As I did, I picked up some bugs that had been too small for me to control before, and my control over my swarm deepened further. I got impressions of what they'd been doing before falling under my control, and with a thought, I put them on autopilot and they resumed it. It was smoother than before, the motions less mechanical, more a play than a puppet show, even if the roles of predator and prey were artificial. But that was promising. I halved it again, reducing it to just the size of the hospital grounds, and suddenly I could sense everyone inside, even without deliberately marking them. Not like that, not like I once had. Instead, I could feel the mites on their skin, the tiny creatures that made the human body their biome. And again, I felt my control deepen. Normally, if I gave my swarm a command, they'd carry it out unless I told them otherwise. If I told them to attack, for example, and was knocked unconscious, they wouldn't stop and I wouldn't be able to stop them. At an eighth of my normal range, a single city block, that control shifted. If I'd wanted to, I could have programmed them with specific instructions, in at least a basic sense. Do this until that happens, then do this other thing. At the same time, I could feel my control, in a way, sense not just my bugs, but the invisible connections between them that I was at the center of. That was useful, but still not what I was looking for. I halved it again, and now it was becoming an effort, a struggle to compress something yet further. But with an effort, I cut it down further, from half the hospital to just my wing of it, feeling a pressure throbbing in my skull. But my sense for chakra clarified as I did. Tattletale had told me that after Bakuta's pain bomb, while I'd still been loopy, I'd been able to hear something through my bugs without even trying. A skill that had taken me a couple months to learn on my own after, with careful focus and effort, done without even trying. Here, now, that same thing happened through a different sense. I've been teaching myself to sense and make sense of chakra for months now, something akin to discovering and learning what new colors meant. But now, I just opened my eyes and saw. Through my Kikaichu, my Shinshu, and those in my father's body, I could smell and taste the difference between types of chakra, even if I wasn't entirely sure what all those different types were. Someone did something in the blank space outside my range, and I could sense it perfectly, even if I didn't have the full context to understand what it was. That was useful, valuable, even now, but still not what I needed. Then I shrank it until it barely covered my hospital room, and had to keep it there for a while, lest I shrink it past the bugs I wanted to ferry to me. But still I couldn't sense the Rinkaichu. Even halving my range 6 times over wasn't enough, and so I knew I'd have to go all the way. But if I did that, I couldn't exactly keep passing them off between dying bugs at a safe distance, because I wouldn't have any distance to keep them at. I took a deep breath. My body was trembling visibly now, and it was hard to keep myself from trembling violently. I fought it through one more time, and nothing changed. I'd never been one to shy from taking a plunge if it got me what I wanted, and I wanted this more than I wanted air. I shifted uncomfortably, took a bit of solace in the now inherent sense for the mutated swarm within me, reminding myself of what I'd faced and overcome in the past. Then I spoke. "Father?" I said, deciding to use my shaking to my advantage. "Can you get me another blanket?" "Of course," my father said, concern flickering across his face before he immediately stood and went to the door. In that moment, my chosen carrier snuck in and landed on my arm, transferring what I desired with that simple contact. It felt enormously, incredibly reminiscent of when Sveta had crushed my arm and had had to convince Lung to burn it off. I exhaled fast, so I wouldn't have air to scream, but I found myself trying to anyway, before I managed to force it down. My room was being monitored, if not as seriously as it probably should have been, but a scream would draw every ninja around. "If you scream, they'll know," I told myself. "If you scream, they'll stop you. If you scream, he'll die." I didn't scream, struggling against the pain in my already aching body. I even managed to shift my arm under the covers to hide most of the evidence, but not before I got a glimpse of what was happening. When it had landed on my hand, that contact had passed the Rinkaichu onto me, and I'd heard it said once that one of the symptoms of receiving a blood transfusion you weren't compatible with was a sudden, existential dread. Well, right now, beneath the pain, I was feeling existential dread in full. It started as a simple purple spot on my skin, but it spread with terrifying speed, and as it did, that purple began to lighten in color, as tens of generations were fed off of my flesh and chakra. It felt like being torn apart and eaten, cell by cell, like my nerves were being chewed on, which might have been exactly what was happening, and my skin began to turn yellow and then slowly gold. Instinctively, I felt myself struggle against it, trying to slow the tide, and knew that if they saw me like this, it'd give it away immediately. But then, suddenly, the color began to change, dyed with a sudden splotch of bright scarlet red. It appeared first as points, and then in long lines, all along my chakra network, but at the edges, that red seemed to fight against the gold. The Rinkaiju had reached, touched, and tried to feed upon the Kyuubi's chakra, and wherever they did, the Rinkaiju died, poisoned by the same thing poisoning me. My grandfather had mentioned it as a possibility, even a concern, but I'd bet my life on it. I didn't have the leeway to exhale in relief. The Kyuubi's chakra should keep them away from my chakra network, which would keep them away from my vital organs, and that meant that I wasn't defenseless against the tiny invaders. If needed, my Shinshu could flood sections of my body with the Kyuubi's chakra for long enough to kill them. That wouldn't be especially pleasant for me either, but being sickened by chemotherapy was better than dying of cancer. Of course, that was assuming that the Rinkaiju didn't adapt with enough exposure and passing generations, that I didn't get sick enough that my control started slipping, and, of course, that their infection didn't just kill me some other way. But this would all be over, one way or another, before that happened. Bearing with the pain, biting down my urge to scream, I shrank my range again, and again, creeping the edge slowly closer. What would happen if I shrank it till it was almost skin tight? Until there was barely anything left of my range and all that power was trapped inside me. I shrank it to my bed, and nothing I cared about changed. I shrank it to just my surroundings on the bed, and my sense for my swarm deepened yet again, but I still didn't care. I shrank it until there was almost nothing left. And suddenly, the wall I'd been beating my hands against until they were bloody came tumbling down. My world fractured. My sense for anything outside my body was gone. But within it, I discovered a world as vast as any I'd ever seen. Yet it was a bizarre, alien world. The world on that scale was foreign, even to me, because I had no reference for what a human body looked like at a molecular level, much less to things that didn't even have true eyes. They only had basic receptors, but even the feedback from those were astonishing, terrifying even, from how bizarre they were. Nothing was smooth, nothing was static. Their world was in constant motion, hammered from every angle by a bombardment of sensations that were tiny to me, but had vast effects for them. My heartbeat felt like a nuclear bomb was going off in the distance, pushing iceberg-like cells through my veins like they were icebergs with rockets strapped to them. My muscles twitched and flexed like tectonic plates. And the Rinkaiju spread like a plague of locusts, guided by no thought but to feed and reproduce. My body was a cornucopia, filled with more food, relatively speaking, than mankind could find on Earth. But it wouldn't be enough of them, spreading as they did. But as my power fell over them, they stopped and calmed, falling quickly into line, even tending to damage that was superficial. Where they had torn my cells apart, I had them gather and repurpose the materials, feeding on them but spreading at a more controlled pace. Slowly, the red and gold markings on my skin grew diluted and faded, and I relaxed slightly, under pressure now, but not as much under pain. I let them spread, slowly and carefully, throughout my body, relearning the sensations of my swarm like I had when I'd first gotten my power. The experience was terrifyingly familiar to that in a lot of ways, reminiscent of when my senses had opened up and left me feeling like I was surrounded by countless alien monstrosities. Ironically, now, the thing that kept me grounded was the feedback of my much larger shinshu, anchors scattered throughout my body. I closed my eyes again, trying to breathe easy as my head continued to pound, but I still felt uncomfortable, worried, scared even, I could admit to myself. I heard the soft footsteps of a nurse coming to answer my father at the door, but I couldn't feel my father or anyone else. My control over the bugs inside my body had never been greater, but I was blind to everything outside myself, in a way I'd all but forgotten about. In a building full of ninjas, their silent footsteps were enough to render them invisible to me. With my eyes closed, I didn't even notice my father return to my bedside and lay another blanket over me. I knew that if I opened my eyes, all I would see was the ceiling. That lack of awareness left me more shaken than I'd like to admit, especially knowing what I'd have to do next. It had taken me about an hour and a half to mentally follow my grandfather home, and another hour to compress my range. Now I spent 3 hours examining myself with my newest swarm, exploring and examining every nook and cranny. It was a lot. I felt things I couldn't name, because I didn't have the medical knowledge, hitched rides on blood cells that felt intercontinental, and explored individual cells like I was sneaking into a house. I examined my body, so I'd at least have a general guideline, and eventually, I found what I was looking for, or rather, recognized that what I was looking for was right in front of me. It was said that chakra, or perhaps more specifically yang chakra or stamina, came from every cell in the body. Here, now, focusing hard, I could feel the tiny channels that guided that incredible minuscule amount of chakra, and which took in the same to function. And on my own, I couldn't sense, much less control chakra on that scale. But what did it matter if I controlled something that was even smaller? This was the level of control I needed to influence cells, to heal a body that was killing itself. And so I used my own body as a testing ground. My body was struck by quick flashes of pain here and there as cells died on the operating table. Really, more died on the construction site, by the hundreds of thousands, and then the millions, and eventually even the billions. But I had trillions of cells to sacrifice. Slowly, I understood what I needed to do. Now, all I needed was to apply it to someone else. Inside of me, one of my shinshu shivered within the bizarre caverns of my body, pulling himself from a mass of limbs and organs before red chakra began to reshape it. An involuntary, uncontrolled transformation became voluntary enough, with my control so deep, and in the end, it was chakra, if a chaotic and bloody mix of many bugs worth of it. I could apply the same shape transformation to it that I had to my range, and these were shapes I knew better than anyone on Earth, and shadows of them lingered within the corrupted insect as I grew it into its new shape. Spider-like legs combined with a dragonfly's eyes and wings. Its carapace was armored, just in case, but light, based on a wasp. Its mouthparts, a mosquito's should suffice, built for speed, maneuverability, dynamic vision, and injection. Then I began to reshape my range again, because I might have had almost nothing left, but I was working with things that were almost nothing as well. Rinkaichu gathered, helping me shape the tiniest droplet of chakra I could gather, and it was like carving out a mountain. They tore it apart into relatively vast sheets of chakra, shifting and welding them together to make something strong. The base shape were hexagons still, but on a much smaller scale, and curved into a cylindrical shape, like a carbon nanotube. At the end of that tube, I built an exceptionally vast sphere, so large atop the cylinder that it was like Atlas holding up the world. So incredibly vast that an entire bug could fit inside it. At the base, more Rinkaichu worked, feeding into the cylinder, lifting the vast structure into the fathomless heavens above the mountain range hairs on my arms. Slowly, carefully, controlling it as delicately as I could, I unraveled it from my skin like a thread, like I was being pulled undone, and let my chosen Shinshu enter the guiding sphere. It crawled out of my body and took flight like a spaceship, carrying roughly 1 billion passengers, connected to me by the tiniest thread of my Higanbana. Navigating through the hospital safely with only a single bug would have been dangerous, if I hadn't already prepared the way, had long since plotted out the shortest path, with the least possible obstructions, and cleared out any obstacles I could. I navigated the path I'd set for myself from memory and scent markers, lacking any other guidance from my swarm, and through a series of vents, I reached my brother's room. With my enhanced control, I could see the doctors fighting to save my brother's life with just a single bug. I waited for what felt like hours, as a pounding pain settled slowly behind my eyes, and the ache of my chakra network settled deep in my body, until I saw my chance. For a moment, all the Medicnin were looking away from my planned landing zone, and my bug moved. A bite transferred the billions of passengers aboard, kept dormant until this moment, and then the bug drew away, hiding out of sight. But inside my brother's body, the Ring Kaichu awoke. They spread subtly in small amounts, leaving no trace on my brother's skin, a mere billion of them passing unnoticed. They spread through his veins and my makeshift tunnel spread with them, guided by the Ring Kaichu at both ends, and they got to work. Again, it was hard to describe. It was like exploring all the chasms of the earth, but they were alive. Every surface was studded with jutting rocks, or even marked by hills and mountains. Cells moved through the body with shocking speed, packed like the worst traffic imaginable, yet never stopping their flow. I didn't have to worry about cleanliness, thankfully, because my little doctors were smaller than bacteria and even most viruses, and anything untowards they carried or came across, they quickly disposed of. What I did have to worry about was the fact that I was going to have to perform roughly 1 trillion surgeries blind, but for my Rinkaichu's senses, and they had only the most basic of eyes. Simple light receptors that sent a chemical signal when they detected light, and no other information. They were deaf too, as sound waves just went around them for the most part. Sense didn't have any meaning on that scale either. I had to rely on a picture painted by a lot of very basic inputs. The good news was, those basic senses were sensitive to incredibly tiny amounts of things. I could feel the slightest change in the health of a host from the smallest difference in acidity, or salt, or any number of other signals. Even better, I didn't need to worry about supplying my own medical chakra, because people were pumping plenty of it into him. I had my Rinkaichu steal it as I carefully spread my control over his body, while sacrificing it for mine. I gathered tiny bits of chakra and carefully reshaped it into the forms I needed. On a whim? No, because I had a wish. I gave it a name I'd heard in passing. Hekija, Sendan Kendatsuba. Hekija meant extermination of evil, used to refer to the destroyer of the demons of plague, and though I wasn't religious, Sendan Kendatsuba was said to protect children from illness and danger. And since he clearly wasn't doing his job, I'd have to pick up the slack. Priorities: brain, heart, lungs, then intestines. I built countless branching highways out of my range, guiding the Rinkaichu where they needed to be. I found the parts in his brain that were fragile compared to mine, and focused on rebuilding a blood vessel in his brain, like I was constructing a subway tunnel, one long enough to stretch across the Pacific 10 times over. Dozens of Rinkaichu clustered around a single cell, working to heal it like they were constructing a house. Microscopic droplets of medical chakra encouraged healthy cells to split and flagging cells to heal. 100 tiny fangs served to keep unhealthy cells from doing so, instead turning them into raw material to be used elsewhere, reinforcing areas that were underdeveloped. His body was betraying him in this regard, struggling to digest and process the nutrients being fed to it through a vein. But I cut out the middleman and did it manually. I gathered what I needed and transported it where it needed to go. Bacteria that were invading his body found themselves taken apart to serve the same end. I focused, even as I felt my aching body tire. I did my best to face away from my father when I felt my nose bleed, and wiped it away quickly, licking up the evidence. Then the Rinkaichu devoured any blood that tried for an encore. As the throbbing in my head turned sharper, I gathered a bit of medical chakra of my own and had my tiny doctors soothe it. It helped a bit, though they couldn't venture too close because my brain was tightly coiled with lines of red chakra. My Shinshu monitored it instead, and I deemed it acceptable. But I had to go slowly, and it was hard. Building a body was very different from tearing one apart. I had to be sure the foundations were stable, that healthy cells were accepted into tissues, that the body didn't have a bad reaction. It meant moving frustratingly slowly, double and triple checking my work. I couldn't exactly sense the clock to check, which was another worrying irritant. I spent what felt like hours performing microscopic surgery on my brother, reconstructing the veins in his brain to prevent any sudden breaches and bleeding, before moving on to his heart. But suddenly the time came for the medical nins to switch shifts. Impatiently, I waited for their replacements to arrive, but it took longer. I didn't have the interest or ability to overhear, but it took long enough that I considered checking. But eventually, after too long, the replacements arrived. They provided the medical chakra I needed for fuel, and I got back to work. At one point, I felt my eyelids droop, my damn infant body tiring. I encouraged my brain to produce a dose of adrenaline to stop it, and got back to work. The jutsu I was using was complicated, even by my standards. But the scale was so small that running out of chakra wasn't a concern, at least not as I was now. If it started to come up, I'd have my Shinshu steal a resupply. The sun set. It rose. I noticed my grandfather rushing to the hospital, having received word of something, but my father seemed elated when the only news was that my brother was making a sudden turnaround. My grandfather looked at me suspiciously, knowing more than my father, but he didn't have the ability to sense microscopic organisms, and there were no marks on my skin. As for anything else, when he entered the room, I turned away from him and managed to pull up my covers, like I was giving him the cold shoulder, hopefully hiding any traces. I felt bad, but I couldn't take any chances. The sun set, rose, set, rose, set, rose. I managed to go 107 hours before my body started rebelling against me in ways I couldn't just suppress, dose, or sting my way through. Slowly. More than I could bear, or at least more than I could hide. As the exhaustion and the pain and the growing nausea took hold, the ache in my body steadily got worse. A heat growing behind my eyes, even as my stomach seemed to flip upside down every few seconds. I blamed my grandfather for having people come feed me what felt like every 5 minutes. Each mouthful more sickening to my stomach than the last, yet finding my body needing more than I was getting. But I didn't say a word about how hungry I was for all the foods put into me, because that would have inevitably been suspicious. I wouldn't say a word for as long as I was able. But however strong my resolve, I couldn't control my body. Or at least I didn't know how to do it properly yet. I got a fever within the first day, partially from the Rinkaichu, partially from pushing my recovering body too hard. And as I kept myself awake, the following days became steadily like a fever dream, making it harder and harder to focus. I started relying on my power, setting things on automatic and checking them over frequently, not able to trust myself fully as my body steadily felt more burnt and raw, my throat more like sandpaper. Keeping my range compressed nearly skin-tight almost constantly was an effort, enough of one that aside from the nosebleeds, I started having bowel issues I also had to suppress. Someone must have noticed something though, because they did blood work just in case. But my Rinkaichu could avoid needles. Grandfather must have suspected I was doing something dangerous though, because by the end of the third day, there were always 2 shinobi in my room instead of just 1. Someone checked the room regularly, but the connection between my brother and I right now was microscopic. And so, I slowly rebuilt the veins in my brother's head. I helped close the opening in his heart. I manually built the lining in his lungs and intestines. I even smuggled in healthy replacement gut bacteria and flora, an experience bizarrely like smuggling whales and elephants across a border, when I found he was lacking important ones. A miracle, they called it, as he experienced a sudden turnaround, growing healthier by the day. Though with every day that went by, I felt worse, dizzier, foggier, more and more off, but I tried not to show it. Not yet. Not until the worst had passed. In the end, I didn't get a choice in the matter, and the cause was almost embarrassing. As far as most tests went, I was fine, apart from a mild fever. All my blood work had come back clean though, and 2 weeks after my surgery, my wounds seemed to have mostly healed, and so they had no reason not to let my father hold me. I remembered to wiggle and try my best to act something resembling normal, before I got tired of it and I just stopped, letting him lift me, and that was all it took. Maybe it was a consequence of staying awake for going on 5 days, or eating so much while still being so hungry. But when my father picked me up, the sudden motion was more than I could bear. "Taura," he said, warmly, kindly, gently. I turned away from him and promptly threw up as my stomach did somersaults. I said, vomiting on the floor almost absently. It was red and purple in the center and deep blue around the edges, and it hissed as it hit the floor. "Taura!" I heard his alarm and felt motion around me, but I had just enough time to withdraw my tiny doctors so they wouldn't run out of control without me, because I cleverly avoided the conversation that would have followed by closing my eyes and passing out. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I might have been in the hospital again for a while, but I woke up in what I think was my room at home. Except home was gone, and the air was colder. A cycle of different medical men came to check on me, but I was barely aware of him, and I don't know what they found. Whenever I woke up, the Rinkaichu dyed my skin red and gold, and everything hurt, but not quite as bad as before. When I could muster up the will, I tried to control him to do I don't remember what, but trying sent flashes of pain through my brain so hot that sometimes I just passed out instead. Eventually I got used to seeing red and gold in the mirror, and used to hating both. But I was so hungry. One of my beehives had grown, filling with chakra-infused honey and beeswax. I brought some to myself and ate them, but I'm not even sure it even reached my belly. My swarm was so hungry, and I was too sick and tired to do anything about it. I ate everything the beehive could spare and only stopped there because it didn't do anything. Instead, I ended up chewing on the toy blocks in my room, just to have something between my teeth. I was so hungry they dissolved in my mouth too. I tried to swallow it before feeling sick and spitting it out as paper mush. Then things got foggy. I remember making paper into a mask at one point, but then the mask started to chitter, clicking its fake teeth together as it floated around my head, while I watched it float around. My father came in and quietly took that mask, locked it in a box, wrapped it in chains and seals, and buried it in the backyard beside some other freshly dug holes. I didn't do anything about it. It might have been a dream. I couldn't remember when I'd been taken home, and sometimes I'd close my eyes and just wake up somewhere else, body aching again and hungry. Sometimes I'd chew on things, and it apparently got severe enough that at some point, everything in my room was replaced with metal. I chewed on it anyway, but after a while my bugs began to eat that too, as desperate as I was. My grandfather rushed in with some kind of extendable gloves and carried me out into the middle of the woods somewhere. He killed a deer, a boar, and a half-dozen birds before my swarm was satisfied, and I ate them, bones and all, melting them as I went. Afterwards he bathed me in ice water, which was as miserable as it sounded. And when he took me back to my room, it was with an ice pack on my head. Rinkaichu are so small, when they build up heat, they don't have the surface area to let it off, so when they get hot, they get agitated. He murmured, sounding like he'd explained this before. It triggers a feeding and breeding frenzy before they die, but it's destructive for both them and their host. Better to keep cool instead. I'm hungry, I said. I know, he told me. But if they eat too much, they might breed too much, and that's bad too. You've already eaten 40 times your body weight today. He held me like that for a while. Although it was already November. How did I know that? He held up an umbrella for me to keep me in the shade too. His expression was tight, but his hand was gentle. He's going to be okay, isn't he? I murmured. Irritation flickered across my grandfather's face. Hush you, he said firmly. If you weren't so sick, I'd be yelling at you right now. Cool off and go to sleep. Sometimes I could feel the damage my swarm was doing to me, but a 5-day surgery must have pushed my body too hard. Was this chakra exhaustion? But I hadn't come close to running out. Or was it because I'd used up so much yin and yang chakra? Or because I'd made myself stay awake for 5 days? Why was my power rebelling like this? Now that I wasn't repairing my brother's body, I'd have to focus on repairing mine, whenever I could muster up the control. And it was bad enough that I fought hard about destroying them, just having them turn upon each other and tear each other apart. But I had a sneaking suspicion that if I gave up my Rinkaichu, my father and grandfather wouldn't let me get another batch. And even if the immediate issues were, hopefully, dealt with, there could be long-term complications. No, better to suffer through it and keep them than give it up and regret it. I know they're angry at me, both my father and my grandfather. I hear them arguing at times. They might have said something to me too, but I kept fading in and out of awareness. Logically, I knew I had to be at least somewhat aware each day to keep the Rinkaichu in check, but sometimes a week would pass in what felt like minutes. You'll have to master your swarm the hard way, one of them said. I don't remember which. From now on, it seems we'll all be studying medical ninjutsu. Oftentimes, I let the Rinkaichu just dye my skin whatever color they wanted, because it took too much effort to suppress them. Sometimes I let my Shinshu do that too. Sometimes I let them swarm my skin, covering me like armor, almost melting into me, and it made it easier to sleep and pretend this wasn't happening. But then, it happened. After another month, just before the end of the year, my mother and brother came home. I was the last to find out, which was still new to me, a consequence of my delirium and shifting range. I just stared, startled, when they entered my room, not sure what to do, or even if this was real. I'm going to pick you up now, my mother said. She didn't wait, didn't show any signs of fear, despite my skin being bright red, and so I hurriedly had to suppress my range to suppress my Rinkaichu before she lifted me. She took a seat in one of the ugly steel chairs in my room. I should say it, I thought, still dizzy. Say it while I can, unlike before. I'm sorry, Mama, I said, sitting in my mother's lap. For causing trouble, for hurting everyone. My mother hummed a gentle sound, simply holding me there for a minute. You love your family a lot, Taura, she said at last. And everyone's hurt and scared because they love you a lot too. I wasn't really sure what to say or do about that. I knew it, probably, but I didn't. Couldn't. I don't know. Maybe I just wasn't good at loving people, or at being loved. Instead, I looked at a tiny, weak bundle across my mother's lap, a small boy with his eyes closed. You haven't hurt, have you? My mother asked, Tawara, this is your little brother Shino. Shino, this is your older sister Tawara, who loves you very much.